Welcome to the Caretakers, a show where we'll talk about what it means to be a caretaker on Earth. Whether we're intentional about it or not, we're all caretakers. We've been entrusted to take care of our family, our friends, our environment, and ourselves. We'll talk about strategies for taking care of yourself, mentally, physically, and spiritually. We'll talk about what it means to take care of others, from your neighbor across the street to the neighbor across the globe. This is going to be a journey of self-discovery and reflection, and we hope you join us as we strive to be the best caretakers we can be. Welcome back to the Caretakers Podcast. I am joined today by Awawdeh. So Awawdeh is currently a policy analyst in the Government of Canada. He's also the advocacy coordinator for Hikma Public Affairs Council, a local public affairs group in London, Ontario, in Canada, that focuses on combating Islamophobia. He's previously worked as a humanitarian and political affairs advisor at the Palestinian Mission to the United Nations in New York City. He completed his bachelor's degree, double major in accounting and international relations, and double minoring in refugee and migrant studies and transitional justice. He's also completed his master's degree in political science, and his master's research was focused on the role of the UN specialized agencies in the protection of civilians in armed conflict. So bringing a ton of experience, and I've known him for quite a while now. Mohammed, thanks for being here.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
So we're coming out of Ramadan now, and for a lot of us, we were still thinking about all the people in Gaza, and we were praying for them and doing what we could from a financial perspective.
Yeah.
But there may have been things that we missed throughout the month, things related to the politics and the behind the scenes things. And so we're hoping to have a conversation about everything we missed in the past month or so, and we can get a little bit more in depth as to some of the headlines that we might have just scrolled past during Ramadan. Okay. So let's start with the NDP motion. So this happened on March 18th.
Yeah.
Happened about a week into Ramadan. And what happened was the NDP brought forward a non-binding motion, which for the first time would force individual MPs in Canada to make a vote on several items, including some of the high-level things: an immediate ceasefire and the release of all hostages, the suspension of all trade in military goods and technology with Israel, and increasing efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas, continued funding to UNRWA, supporting the prosecution of war crimes for the ICC and the ICJ, humanitarian aid access, banning settlers, and one of the most important items was recognition of a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
So those were all things that came in the original motion, and you can tell us a little bit more about what happened after that.
Yeah. So just to track back a little bit, there are a couple of different ways that a government or parliament can adopt motions. So opposition day motions are essentially one part or one kind of motions that do get passed in parliament.
Okay.
These are non-binding. And opposition day motions are a chance for, we do have the official opposition, so the Conservatives, in this case, they do have a good portion of those dedicated days for the other parties. Then you go into the smaller parties, such as the NDP, the Bloc, and possibly the Greens. They do have a chance to introduce certain motions. These are non-binding in the sense that...
Just explain what the non-binding means.
So the government doesn't have to abide by them. They can, it can still pass, but it's up to the government to decide how to implement it, whether it implements it even.
Okay.
And it doesn't have the same weight as other motions. So other motions, for example, let's say something that's called a private member's bill, and that is an actual dedicated bill that goes through parliament, and sometimes it can, essentially that's what we call legislation, and then part of the legislation might include coming into force through regulations. The non-binding motions or the opposition day motions are a little bit less strict in that term, or in that sense. It kind of affords the government the chance to declare its position on a certain topic of interest for the parties, but not necessarily enact it. It can still do it, but there is a little bit less kind of burden on the government to put it into force.
And these opposition days, how often is let's say the NDP getting an opposition day in a calendar year?
It's actually per I would say I think the last time I looked at it, it's actually per parliamentary session,
Okay.
not necessarily per calendar year. And the calendar year can be kind of split into 2 parliamentary sessions. But in total, I think the NDP have 3 more opposition days available for them.
Right. So this is not something that's coming around all the time. So in that sense, there is significance to them using an opposition day motion.
Yeah. So usually when
Palestine.
parties do introduce a motion during their opposition days, it's issues of interest to the party.
Okay.
So, for example, I can tell you for a fact that the upcoming opposition day motion, for example, for the NDP, will be something for their voter base. So something related to the cost of living or combating corporate greed, things like this that are of importance to them. And
Right.
we know the NDP's position on Palestine has been somewhat of a positive position in the sense that they do have it as a priority foreign policy issue. But again, like we do need to just understand a little bit that it's not the priority issue for the NDP because they do have other issues of importance.
Right, of course. I mean, like we're Canadians, right?
Exactly.
So they're going to focus on Canadian issues, which is what they should be doing as the government of Canada.
Exactly. So the fact that they used one of their days for that specific motion is a huge deal in of itself.
Right. And I mean, credit to them for bringing that forth. I know there's certain MPs in particular that really push for that, like MP Heather McPherson or like a Matthew Green and the different MPs they've gotten here, even locally with Lindsay Matheson. I feel like it was nice to see this brought forth in the first place.
Yeah.
Just to, for the first time, to force all the MPs to put their actual positions down in writing in a way, right? To actually have to vote.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I mean, like when we looked at it, we did call it, at least in the political circles, that it is a litmus test for politicians. That we have politicians who call for a 2-state solution. Great, but you can put it into motion by calling for a recognition of a Palestinian state. For a 2-state solution to work, you need to have 2 states, and there is already one, and you're trying to push for the other, right? So that's one part of the equation, and there is the other issue that the government, for example, called for sanctions on Israeli settlers or extremist settlers, to be specific, per the government's language. That was the chance for the government to go out and actually put it into motion. So you have all of these things in the original motion. We can go through them one by one if you want.
Yeah, so let's go through it. So obviously what ended up happening is the motion went forward. Later into the night, the Liberal Party came back with basically like 14 amendments.
Yeah. So actually, before that, it was supposed to go it was supposed to go during the last session or the last sitting day of February.
Okay.
And it was on the agenda of Parliament. You can go and, for example, check the House of Commons the day before, and it was supposed to go out. And everybody was prepared based on the lobbying efforts, the letter writing campaigns. I forgot the exact date, but it was the last sitting day in February. The night before the motion, former Prime Minister Mulroney passes away.
Right.
And part of the parliamentary procedure is that they actually canceled the sitting day on that day and then moved it to the first sitting day in March. And March was weird because they had almost 3 weeks of break time where MPs ended up coming back to their constituencies and perform their duties as MPs in their constituencies. So they weren't back in Ottawa until March 18th. So there was kind of a good break in between, and it diluted some of the efforts that we had as community members, the lobbying efforts at least. But then towards the end, it did pick up, right? So that's the background of why it came in the middle of March as opposed to end of February.
Right. Okay.
So that's the first.
To know, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the first issue with it. The timing of not just when those amendments were issued, is the fact that it actually did take 3 weeks, or it did give the government 3 weeks to go out and debate, ideally debate amendments or anything of that sort. It didn't. So we can just go through the how the day played out initially. The motion, the original motion by the NDP did call for specific things, such as banning extremist Israeli officials and settlers.
Yeah, I saw the language they used was Israeli officials that are inciting genocide, I believe was the word they used. I'm just trying to find it now here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that part was removed from the.
Exactly. So we can go through exactly what the original motion tried to accomplish. So it kind of wanted, or at least the NDP wanted, to ban extremist Israeli officials and settlers, and not just leave it as settlers. The original motion asked for an increase in the number of Palestinian refugees or temporary asylum seekers, or what they call it here in Canada, temporary residents.
Right.
And it called for an increase on the cap of the people that are coming from Gaza. And it right now, so essentially the government has a cap of 1,000 people officially. In writing, it has a cap of 1,000 people. Till now, the government has not processed any of them, I believe. And there are specific restrictions on who can apply and who can't. The NDP motion tried to remove the cap. 1,000 people from a war zone, essentially it's nothing.
Right.
So that was one of the kind of the areas that the NDP motion, the original motion, wanted to tackle.
Yeah.
Then there was the issue regarding the sales of arms to Israel.
So I've got them all here, like listed with the actual change in terminology, because I want to be accurate in terms of what actually changed.
Yeah.
And so I'll read you the original, and I'll read you the amended version.
Perfect.
And then we can talk about the differences. So the one you're talking about there. So the original text said, suspend all trade in military goods and technology with Israel and increase efforts to stop the illegal trade of arms, including to Hamas.
Yeah.
The amended wording says, seize the further authorization and transfer of arms exports to Israel to ensure compliance with Canada's arms exports regime. So in my view, when I read that, two major changes. The difference between suspend all trade and seize the further authorization.
Yeah.
I that was a big difference to me. And then instead of saying suspend all trade in military goods and technology with Israel, it changed to ensure compliance with Canada's arms export regime, which I think is, in my opinion, that one's fine. Like that's what we're not asking for anything extraordinary.
Yeah. So you're right. The change in the language of the first phrase of this paragraph is drastic, in the sense that the original motion asked for a complete cessation of arms trade between Canada and Israel. What the government actually proposed, and again, this came all at the very last minute.
Right.
If you were watching the debate, they were getting ready to go and vote. The Liberal House leader came in with essentially amendments at the very last minute, and MPs of all parties were not consulted. Except for a select few from the NDP side and Liberals who were debating, or who were negotiating the terms of this or of these amendments. So the amended language in that specific paragraph gave the government the ability to focus on what happens, after the motion gets passed. And the issue with that is that the government authorized sales of arms after October 7th. And during the past 6 months, there were a number of military authorized or sales exports authorizations between Canada and Israel. So it gave Canada, at least the government, the ability to focus on what happens next, as opposed to remedy what happened prior to the motion. The second part, as you said, it's not that problematic, because there are specific guidelines on the export of arms, and they do have to comply with again, Canadian law, international law, specific UN resolutions. So it does have to comply with that. So that change in the second portion of the that paragraph is not that problematic. The problematic part actually came at the start.
Right. Okay, so the next one was about UNRWA.
Yeah.
And so the original language said, immediately reinstate funding and ensure long-term continued funding to UNRWA and support the independent investigation. Yeah. The revised wording was much longer, and it said, ensure continued funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, to meet the dire humanitarian need, engage with the UN internal investigation independent review process, and ensure implementation of necessary long-term governance reforms and accountability measures.
Yeah.
So again, the one that I picked up on there was, instead of it saying immediately reinstate funding, it said ensure continued funding.
Yeah.
So weaker language there.
Not necessarily.
No?
Not
Okay.
not necessarily, because at that point, so when the motion was first introduced in February, and put before the House, what we call, in circulation, or I think you want to call it tabling, so that way it is public. This is the final version of the motion. That happened in February. Again, that's the reason why I mentioned the first part.
And they already announced
So prior to that, the government actually had suspended or had not authorized the release of payment for this fiscal year for UNRWA. It's usually paid in April of each fiscal year. By then, the government actually had not reinstated. Between the period of February and when the House went back into a sitting day, the government had actually announced that it is resuming funding of UNRWA. So it's more operational rather than political.
Okay, so this part I think is political, and you can tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
To go from ensure long-term continued funding, to ensure continued funding, no long-term, to meet the dire humanitarian need. That seems a lot more short-term to me than long-term.
Also, it's actually not that political. Okay. There are political considerations, but we are at least preparing for an election year, right? And we understand the conservative position on UNRWA, that they're not going to fund it. Again, under Harper, they essentially froze all funding to UNRWA. They did not see it as a legitimate organization, or at least a legitimate body for the protection of Palestinian civilians or Palestinian refugees. The fact that they removed that terminology between long-term and short-term, or the long-term funding, there are political considerations in the fact that they cannot guarantee long-term funding of UNRWA if in a year or so there might be a change in government, and there will be essentially no mechanism in place to ensure long-term funding of the agency.
Okay.
The other thing too, UNRWA actually does have an issue with long-term funding, in the sense that a couple of years ago when I was at the UN, we were working on creating a waqf, or an endowment fund for UNRWA, because it continued to run a deficit year after year. That became an issue, especially during the Trump administration, when he cut the funding completely. So UNRWA was running a deficit, or a shortfall, of $440 million a year. And that had implications on schools, hospitals. We can go a little bit deeper into UNRWA towards later in this, but there was literally no guarantee of countries to give long-term funding. There were promises made, what we call a 4-year contribution, but Canada announced its 4-year contribution 2 years ago. So we're looking at the 2-year mark, or the 3-year mark right now. Next year there will be the fourth year in that contribution, and then after it there will be or there might be a change of government. So the change between long-term and short-term is not that. I wouldn't consider it a political change.
Okay. No, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, man, this is some boring stuff. Like this is this is the reality of politics. Like you have these motions that go through, and the wording is actually extremely important, and the way that things are written is intentional. Never by accident that something is written in the way that it's written.
It is.
Usually we'll find out later on if something was missed or anything like that. But at the moment, every word is very intentional in the way that it's written.
Yeah, no, it is. Like the writing motions and resolutions and all of that, they are, and at least in government, we write regulations, and regulations are legal documents, and we have what we call jurilinguists, and their job is they speak the language of the law, and certain words actually matter. So I'll give you a quick example. Like at the UN, we had what we call the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. And during that negotiation of that document, Russia, the United States, and countries of the global north called or were debating a portion of the text that called for international cooperation versus burden sharing. When you look at those two phrases, it sounds similar. Countries like Jordan, for example, which hosts refugees, called for what they said was burden sharing. So the host country of refugees cannot just bear the responsibility of the infrastructure providing basic services to the refugees. They need other countries of the global north to actually go beyond just, for example, supplying them with specific aid programs. They need specific funding in order to help those refugees. The United States, Russia, and other countries actually said, hold on a second, no, we're not going to assume the burden. We're just going to assist you and through cooperation. So the US aid and all of that. So
reminds me of like group projects in the
exactly
in school.
Exactly, right?
Are you burden sharing or are you cooperating?
So part of that actually, so the language matters. So in this case, language does matter in the sense that we cannot commit to long-term funding when we actually do not know if the government will be here in its current form in 2 years and without a change in government. So again, like this, it's a long-term thing in the sense that the liberal government might exist today, but then in 2 years' time we'll have a conservative government. In the next election, people will hold the current liberal government accountable and say, well, hold on, you said long-term funding, but it didn't last more than 2 years. Where did the money go?
Right.
So it's not, sometimes like the language, when there is a change in language, it does matter, and other times it's not as evil as it looks.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
This one was interesting. I wasn't sure why they did this, but there was the original wording said, support the prosecution of all crimes and violations of international law committed in the region, and support the work of the ICC and the ICJ. And that was one phrase.
Yeah. And they split it into two. Why did they do that? It's to make it flow better. Because sometimes, again, words do matter, but at the same time, you also want to make it a little bit easier. So it is easier to say support the work of looking into crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, etc. Like, it's not just about that specific wording, but then there are other mechanisms that you can hold violators of international law accountable beyond the ICC and the ICJ.
I see.
Okay. So this specific example, it's not necessarily them circumventing the fact that they can hold people accountable through the ICJ and ICC. It actually is just to show support for the ICC and the ICJ. Canada's policy does say that it does support the work of those two international courts. So it is easier for them to just put them in a separate sentence, and then the one before just say that we investigate crimes. But again, like there is an issue that, again, we've seen time and time again that Israel ends up investigating itself. So there is opening that room for these kind of actions by Israel to just simply investigate itself. And through that, Israel becomes essentially the judge, jury, and executioner, which is, we have seen multiple occasions in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and the investigation, even more recently, in the killing of humanitarian workers. It just ends up investigating itself. Not sure what kind of repercussions happen during that investigation. And then it just comes out and says, we investigated ourselves. So these are the findings. Let's move on to the next, war crime, basically.
Okay. So unimpeded humanitarian access to Gaza didn't change.
Yeah.
We talked briefly about the change in the cap on so originally the wording was ensure Canadians trapped in Gaza can reach safety in Canada and lift the arbitrary cap of 1,000 temporary resident visa applications. And they just changed that to expand access to the resident visa program. So just getting rid of the
again, like the NDP motion did go above or beyond the normal protocol that you have as MPs, as politicians. When you call, for example, an arbitrary cap,
Yeah, like it's like a shot at them, basically. That
exactly. So it is easier to just say, expand access, etc., without going into that kind of language. So it's saving face for the government a little bit.
Right. Okay. Ban extremist settlers from Canada. Again, this is the original wording. Ban extremist settlers from Canada, impose sanctions on Israeli officials who incite genocide, and maintain sanctions on Hamas leaders. That changed to drop the part about imposing sanctions on Israeli officials who incite genocide.
Yeah.
You'd have to ban everybody basically from the from the Israeli government.
Essentially, yes. And part of that is what we called for as community members is the sanctioning of two specific Knesset members who are also members of the government, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich.
Right.
So Ben-Gvir is the Minister of National Security of Israel, and Smotrich is the Minister of Finance, and he does hold other portfolios related to the expanding settlements in the West Bank.
And they were named in the ICJ filings by South Africa. They were like, these are when we talk about far right government. Yeah. This is anything beyond what you're talking about,
Israeli
far right government.
Yeah, so Canada. For background, Ben-Gvir actually is part of what they call in Israel the Kahanist. And the Kahanists are essentially a group of, I don't want to say politicians, but extremist members of society that reject any Palestinian claim to the land whatsoever. And they are actually, part of their group were actually responsible for the massacre that took place in the in what we call in Arabic Masjid al-Ibrahimi, or the Abrahamic Mosque in Hebron. And they are partly responsible for that. It's a member of their group.
Right.
So even Israel itself declares the Kahanists as a terrorist organization.
Right.
So here's the Israel itself does declare that group as a terrorist organization. Ben-Gvir, as a youth member of his community, actually was part of the Kahanist group. So when he became a member of Knesset, he actually moved away from that umbrella of labeling and created his own, or became part of a different party in politics in the Israeli Knesset, made up of people who still have the same views as the Kahanists, but in a way that they're not recognized as a terrorist organization.
Right. And some people might be to look at that and be like, well, that was in the past and maybe his views have evolved. But we're talking about a guy who attended, I think along with Smotrich, these festivals and celebrations about settling Gaza.
More, actually. So Ben-Gvir...
This is like recently. This is in the last month or so.
Oh, yeah. And even before any of this, Ben-Gvir is extremely divisive in Israeli community. He was rejected by a good portion of Israelis during the elections for his language, for example, on settling more people in the West Bank, even refusing to call it the West Bank, referring to it as Judea and Samaria. Saying, for example, there was a video of him, he goes out and says, listen, I am sorry, but the rights of me and my children trump yours and your children. He's telling an Arab TV host or a guest, I think, that his rights as an Israeli Jewish citizen trump that of the other individual as an Israeli Arab Muslim individual. So again, they both hold an Israeli citizenship, but Ben-Gvir is advocating for segregated roads for Jewish Israelis versus Muslim and Arab Israelis. So that's one of the first issues that happened. When he came into power, people realized that he is not just, hateful towards Arabs. He's actually hateful towards anyone who is not Jewish and who is not essentially white. There is an issue of the migrants into Israel, the Ethiopian migrants. Right. Ben-Gvir actually was on the opposing end of that. The other thing, there was the killing of the Dawabsha family, which I think happened in 2015 or 2014. I forgot the exact date. And an Israeli settler from a group they call the Hilltop Youth, that is essentially another terrorist organization that does not recognize Palestinian presence in the West Bank. And they went into a village in the West Bank called Douma. They went and set a house on fire of civilians. They're Palestinian civilians. They're still sleeping. That was the middle of the night. It killed an 18-month-old child, Ali Dawabsha. Killed his parents, and I forgot the name of the surviving son, but he's I think he was a toddler. I think he was 4 years old at that point. And he's now living with his extended family members, severely burnt. So what happened is that Ben Gvir came to the rescue of the settler who started that arson attack. So even before he was a member of Knesset, so he has been involved in it's not necessarily just language. He has been involved in protecting those who commit deadly attacks against Palestinians.
Right. And so when you drop this wording about imposing sanctions on Israeli officials who incite genocide, you're protecting the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches of the world. That
exactly, under the assumption that they are members of government. Members of government get immunity, which is not necessarily true, because it is members of government who incite genocide. It's not, the general public can't participate in it. Ideally, they wouldn't. But it is the government who calls for, orders the soldiers and orders the armed forces to commit certain acts, genocide or not. It's essentially the government. And as Minister of National Security, he actually does play a big part in that.
Right.
He was responsible for arming settlers in the West Bank. In the middle of October, he gave them full automatic weapons without any training, without anything. And it was especially dangerous because it was a time of emotional, instability for these settlers who are, even without what happened in October, they are extremist settlers. They continue to terrorize Palestinians. So by arming them, he was participating in genocide. So the fact that language was dropped is extremely disappointing. Right. And again, Ben Gvir and Smotrich are both settlers. So you can't just ban extremist settlers without banning the officials who are also settlers. So it's not mutually exclusive, but in some way or another, the government found a way to give them immunity in that way.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about the next one. Advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories and work toward a two-state solution. So that one was changed to reaffirm that settlements are illegal under international law, and that settlements and settler violence are serious obstacles to a negotiated two-state solution, and advocate for an end to the decades-long occupation of Palestinian territories. Yeah. So they seem like two different, it doesn't even really seem like an amendment. It seems like two different things.
Not necessarily. The language that was, again, we look at the NDP motion, and portions of it are what we call activist language. Right. So it is decades-long occupation, but it's a decades-long occupation because it's not necessarily just the fact that Israel has a military presence. It's the fact that there are settlements in the West Bank that are being expanded more and more and more with every passing day. And settlements are actually legal under international law. It's not... Again, international law is a very unique topic because there is no enforcement mechanism, but the settlements constitute what is referred to in the Geneva Conventions as transfers of population. You're transferring part of your population from within your own territory and you're moving it to an occupied territory. Thus, you're kind of making them a permanent structure of that occupied territory, and at the same time you're uprooting the native population. So they are illegal under international law. So the fact that the government actually specified that, I would take it as a positive. That settlements are illegal under international law settler violence is an issue, and then work towards ending the decades-long occupation, work towards a two-state solution. So they just added a portion where it actually reaffirms the illegality of those settlements.
Right. And a little bit on those settlement attacks. I mean, we've got some of the stats here. So there's been 561 incidents of Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians between October 7th and February 20th.
Yeah.
As of January 17th, settlers have killed at least 8 Palestinians and injured 111. So these are just people. This isn't the Israeli military.
Yeah.
These are people who've decided to take matters into their own hands. They are supported by the army. So there's no really any real consequences for doing this.
Yeah, exactly.
And the word settler is actually very funny because it assumes like you're just like, it sounds so nice and we're settling and like you're having.
I mean, like you can also make the argument that we here are settlers, like in Canada, like it's even as immigrants we are settlers, but there's a difference.
But this is not people sitting on empty pieces of land. So this violence by settlers has led to the displacement of 1,200 Palestinians, including 586 children across 200 households.
Yeah.
There are 200 households that have been removed from probably generational homes by force by these settlers.
Exactly.
And just in the West Bank alone, since October 7th, 464 Palestinian civilians were killed and 4,800 have been injured. And, you know, where we're sitting now, these attacks only seem to be intensifying with no real repercussions for that.
Yeah. So essentially, some organizations actually kept or tried to keep up with the increased settlement or settler violence. So, for example, OCHA has a daily or a weekly dashboard that it updates. Even these organizations are having trouble keeping up with the number of expanding settler attacks. In the last week alone, and that's the week of April, correct me if I'm wrong, April 7th, right? Since April 7th, we have seen an increased amount of settler violence committed against Palestinian civilians. Yesterday and the day before, Palestinian civilians were killed directly by settlers. We're not talking now about the army. We're talking about what Israel considers to be their own civilians, just armed. So those are settlers that reject any Palestinian presence in the West Bank. They believe that they have the full and undisputed rights to all Palestinian lands. And they actually refuse to call it the West Bank. As I said, like they keep referring to it as Judea and Samaria.
Right. And that's a reference to sort of this God-given right to the land.
Exactly. So there is that issue in the sense that you have extremist individuals, and you place them in stolen territory, and you give them arms, and you say, "Have fun." And this is not just because of October 7th. We've seen it even before.
Right.
A couple of months prior to October, we've seen the settlers commit massive attacks against small towns in the West Bank. For example, in Turmus Aya, they actually went. They burned most of the vehicles that they've seen. They broke the windows of houses, essentially to terrorize those individuals living in there. And they killed a Palestinian American citizen who was there after getting married, and he's trying to get his wife to the U.S. And then prior to that, there were the continued attacks against the Palestinian civilians in Awawdeh. And during that time, it's not just the settlers, but also the IDF, and also Smotrich came out and said, Awawdeh needs to be wiped off of the face of earth. So it's the civilians or the settlers who are kind of branded as civilians. You have the IDF and you have the government officials, cabinet members who are calling for that. So since, the start of last week, the attacks against Palestinian civilians in small villages and towns intensified in a manner that, it's unbelievable. And we've seen yesterday, a 17-year-old child was shot and killed. Thousands were injured during the past week. Cars, personal properties, they were all destroyed. Fields were set on fire, so olive fields. So again, I think you said 200 Palestinian homes. but that does not include the Palestinian lands. So especially in areas near Ramallah and Deir Dubwan and like even in Jenin, there are Palestinian lands that Palestinians depend on for their basic income. So the olive fields, they use it on an annual basis to produce olive oil through their olive farms and export it. So a lot of the Palestinian civilians living in that area actually depend on those areas, on those farms and their plots of land. And what Israel has done is, it terrorizes those living in their homes, but it actually goes beyond that and terrorizes the landowners and claims or annexes parts of those lands.
Right. Yeah, it's so much to take in at once, honestly.
Yeah.
Let's go back. I want to just go back to the motion, because on one last item, which is actually kind of the flagship item in the motion. But so the original language was officially recognize the state of Palestine and maintain Canada's recognition of Israel's right to exist and live in peace with its neighbors. And that was changed to work with international partners to actively pursue the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, including towards the establishment of the state of Palestine as part of a negotiated two-state solution, and maintain Canada's position that Israel has a right to exist in peace and security with its neighbors. And so we've gone from official recognition, call it immediately. I don't know, there's probably some mechanisms that need to take place for it to happen, but official recognition to working with international partners to actively pursue the goal of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, which sounds a lot like the continued peace process that's been dangled in front of our faces for a long time.
Yeah, no, it is actually exactly that. So there is the argument, and it's not just Canada. It's the United States. It's even in the past the UK, but the UK changed its language a little bit. But essentially, it says that the recognition of a Palestinian state by these countries doesn't matter as long as Israel does not recognize it. And the path forward, again, this is the argument, but we can dissect it fully, that if Israel does not recognize officially a state of Palestine, then what's the point of us recognizing? And then they consider that to be a unilateral position, that we can recognize a Palestinian state, but then we circumvent the peace process and we just set up everyone to fail, etc., etc.
Right, because the peace process has been great.
Yeah, that's the issue, right? So, and there are political issues with that. So there are a number of things that are always waived in international relations. So for the peace process, there is what we call the Arab Peace Initiative, or in other in other words, it's called Land for Land Peace Initiative, and or Land for Peace. So essentially, the way that it's done is that the OIC group, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, as well as the League of Arab States, proposed certain things that said, if those certain conditions are met, then we will recognize an Israeli state. That includes the recognition of a Palestinian state, the complete demilitarization of, or the complete exit of Israeli forces from the West Bank, the removal of the settlements and the settlers from the West Bank, the lifting of the blockade on Gaza, etc., etc. Those conditions need to be met by Israel. The biggest one, or actually all of them, are a non-starter for the Israelis. So that peace initiative is out of the window. There is the other one is called the Quartet Roadmap, and the Quartet is it's the 4 countries that are associated. So Russia, the United States, and I forgot the 2 others. That essentially says like, hey, hold on a second, like we will go out and we'll negotiate with the 4 of us to help implement a peaceful solution that provides some form of a state for the Palestinians and provides a state for the Israelis, or maintains a state for the Israelis, and they can live side by side in peace, etc., etc. So that's one part of that. There is the Madrid Peace Conference. So all of those things are just like part of the peace process. And what Canada, through these amendments, what the government actually did is that said, you know what, like, we're not going to recognize a Palestinian state because it's unilateral. If we do that, then we circumvent the peace process. There's nothing that comes out of it if we do that. And let's just leave it to the Israelis and Palestinians to figure it out through negotiations, through these peace processes that have been failing. But the reason why Canada actually went back to them, because it gives them complete it absolves them of complete failure in the international stage. So it's really easy to say, hold on, like, we're not going to make an announcement, we're not going to recognize Palestine. It's not up to us if we recognize it or not. Nothing is going to change. Let's just focus on supporting the partners who work on this. And the issue with that is that the U.S. has a monopoly over the peace process. The U.S. tries to play a big part. Russia tries to play a big part. And it goes back to a topic in international relations. It's called, it's actually through a book by Brzezinski. It's called The Grand Chessboard. And it contends that there are two sides on the chessboard, like just a normal chessboard, and the U.S. is one side, Russia is one side, and they all play certain moves during their dealings in international relations. The book is quite old, but it's very, very relevant now. And the reason why Canada does not want to recognize a Palestinian state is because it goes against U.S. policy, and U.S. policy wants to maintain the hold on that part of the chessboard in the Middle East by saying, hold on, like, we will declare a Palestinian state once we make sure that the negotiations are done. That changed under Trump a little bit when he said, you know what, I don't care about the Palestinians. What I care about is normalization in the region. The Palestinians will come along. So there is that trend now to move away from recognizing a Palestinian state because as a condition for peace in the region, and say, hold on, like, we're just going to normalize relations between countries, between Israel and Gulf countries. Once we do that, Palestinians will come along. So Canada did not want to do that, which is a failure of international, and their presence in the international arena, in the sense that you cannot push for a two-state solution if you're missing half of that equation.
Right.
You already have recognized an Israeli state. How would you work towards a two-state solution if you do not recognize the second part? Which is, again, and I might be going into more in depth, but there are certain UN resolutions that, as a condition for Israel to be recognized, so Resolution 181 and 194, say, like, as a condition for Israel to be recognized at the UN as a state, a Palestinian state needs to be maintained, and the presence of a Palestinian population needs to be maintained, protected. So two states have to exist. That was a condition or a precondition for Israel to exist after the partition plan. One half of that resolution actually remains unfulfilled till now, and Canada, through its rejection of the recognition of a Palestinian state, contributes to that continued failure of the international community to not fulfill one part of those resolutions.
Right. It seems like we've talked quite a bit about the international law aspect and the impacts on the Middle East, but there is also a political play within the parties here in Canada that's going on with this motion in particular.
With this motion in particular, they're from what in conversations and discussions we've had, not just me, but we as members of the political circle, we did understand, and I'll give you the numbers. This is the greatest thing to ever come out of this. That the Liberal Party is extremely divided,
right,
on this issue. So we had the NDPs who were fully on board with this motion. We had the Bloc that were also in support. The Greens were also in support. And initially, we've heard that around 50 or 60 Liberal MPs were going to vote for the motion. We later found out that was 80.
Wow. So in the original language.
We found out that 80, at least 80 Liberal MPs signal. So the way that it's done is that you have to send essentially an email or some form of communication to the party's whip and say, I'm going to vote in this specific manner for this motion. It's not just on Palestine, just in general,
right.
Just to make sure that government knows exactly what it's dealing with. So 80 MPs were going to vote in motion or in favor. And initially, the government didn't think the numbers.
How many does that leave that were voting against of the Liberals?
I forgot I know that there were some movements between, some members of the Liberal Party went as independent during the session.
Yeah, I think I can.
So I think it's around 160? Or maybe a little bit less.
I think a little bit less than that.
Yeah.
But anyways, so
a good
a bit
portion.
More than half.
Yeah. If it is less than 160, then you're looking at more than half of the sitting government actually voting in favor of a motion without any amendments. So that would have signaled to essentially everyone that the government is fully divided on this issue. And I think that was part of the litmus test that I discussed earlier, is that it would have shown Canadians who exactly stands on what side.
Right.
And in London, we have two MPs who have been wonderful on this issue. They have been vocal on the issue of what is happening in Gaza. They have been vocal about their support for a Palestinian state living side by side with Israel. They have been vocal about that. Two other MPs, one we haven't, the Conservative MP, we haven't heard much from. And to be honest, that's it's part of the politics. Her writing is really not that interested in foreign affairs. The remaining MP, who's a Liberal, has not been listening to the community. So the motion in its original language would have afforded, for example, communities like ours, the chance to see who stands on what side.
Right.
In London, it would have been a little bit clearer. Other cities and other communities might not have been as clear. So it would have been a chance for communities around Canada to see where exactly does my MP stand on this issue. Do they recognize a Palestinian state or do they not? Do they want to push for a sanction of extremist officials who greenlight genocide, or do they want to give them immunity? So that would have been the perfect chance. And with the division in government that we've seen in that kind of manner, that the motion might have passed. We're looking there were some numbers, or it would have been very close to passing. The issue with that is that I think the failure of the motion or its passing, in the sense that it is a non-binding motion, wouldn't have mattered. Again, like the government might come out and say, you know what, we're not going to vote in favor of this. As when I say the government, I mean the cabinet. Because the party is already divided.
Right.
The cabinet, the prime minister, all the ministers, including Minister Hussein, for example, might have been forced to vote against the motion. So had that happened, and let's say the motion passed, then the government might simply say, you know what, we're not gonna implement it. And that would have been catastrophic for the government close to an election, to have a motion like this, of this kind of magnitude, be passed and not be implemented. The other side of it is that if it fails, I think that would have been, another rallying call for community members to lobby, to be more involved politically, etc. So what the government did is that when it saw that 80 members of its party were going to vote in favor, it cut it really close. So the government at the very last minute said, hold on, we have amendments. And these amendments
So they just water it down to the point where it doesn't actually matter as much, and
it's not
more people
as
can
much
vote.
what the government did. And if you pay attention to everything that they said in these amendments, essentially it's just a reiteration of their past statements.
Right.
They just put it into emotion.
So they get to protect the Peter Fragascados of the world, and they get to protect those MPs that would probably have.
I'm not going to name like specific MPs, right? Yeah. But like exactly. So certain MPs that have kind of took a shield behind the weak statements in some cases that the government is putting out. So for example, the statement on the ICC and the ICJ. There was a debate that, hold on a second, you need to come out and actually support the ICC and the ICJ. What is the statement? Like, this is horrible. Right. And the government came out and said, well, no, the statement actually supports the ICC and the ICJ. We said that. And then that's our community who's, being told that. The other community goes and says, well, how dare you actually support the work of the ICJ in this manner when they're targeting Israel? And the government says, well, hold on. We said we support the work of the ICC and the ICJ. We didn't say we support what it's doing right now. So there is that kind of language as for all its flaws, the government actually, and the people who wrote these statements know exactly what they're doing. And the people who passed the motion or passed those amendments also know exactly what they're doing. So it's just watered down, not just because the language is weak, but because they reiterated very weak statements.
Right. Okay, so we spent quite a bit of time talking about this NDP motion on March 18th. But some of the other things that might have happened that people might have missed between then was March 25th, there was this UN Security Council declaration, a demand for a ceasefire where the U.S. abstained. Mm-hmm. And so the demand was for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian group Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and the release of all hostages. The 14 council members, so there's 15 Security Council members, 14 of them voted in favor of the resolution. Mm-hmm. And the resolution was brought forth to the Security Council by 10 elected members of the council. Yeah. I believe it was all the permanent members.
So the permanent members are the E5 the P5. And the elected ones are the E10, right? So the permanent ones, Russia, the United States, France, the UK, and China.
Right.
So we've seen the number of resolutions that went out to the Security Council. They get vetoed, one by Russia, one by the United States, another time by Russia, another time by the United States. So what happened is that the elected 10 initially had a draft. The U.S. said, hold on a second, do not put that draft out. We have our own draft resolution that we want to put out. And the U.S. came and again, as I said, we call it tabling. They tabled their resolution. They, without any negotiation, the courtesy or the political, protocols is for the U.S. to say, hold on, we'll send you a draft of what we want to put. We want to hear your input. We want to try to find a way to incorporate your input into this resolution. The U.S. did not do that. They just sent it directly to them, and they said, we're tabling this. Put it in blue. When you put it in blue, that means it's going before the Security Council the next day or the next day that the Security Council is meeting. And the U.S. did that. And it was an extremely long resolution. You look at it and you say, you don't know where the operative paragraphs start, when their preamble or paragraph start. It was extremely long and diluted. So Russia came out and vetoed it. I think China voted against as well. And it failed. So the elected members already had a draft that they wanted to put out. After the U.S. stopped it, they ended up putting it out. The U.S. said, you know what, doesn't matter. We're not going to veto it. The language is already weak, so we're just going to abstain. And they abstained. So the resolution is a little bit legally binding. It is a Security Council resolution. So ideally, a normal country would abide by Security Council resolution.
So I want to talk about this reaction, actually. So the reaction to this Security Council resolution, which was, by the way, for we're talking about an immediate ceasefire. Yeah. It was a ceasefire until the end of Ramadan, which is 2 weeks at the time. When it was released. And so the reaction was interesting. So Netanyahu's reaction was calling it a clear retreat from the previous position. The reaction to the U.S. abstaining specifically. Yeah. So the reaction to the U.S. abstaining. He called it a clear retreat from the U.S.'s previous positions and said it would hurt the war efforts against Hamas as well as efforts to release Israeli captives held in Gaza. The U.S. then came out insisting that the abstention did not represent a shift in policy.
Yeah.
Then you had Netanyahu canceling a high-level delegation that was on its way to Washington to discuss the invasion of Rafah. And then you had John Kirby, who's the White House National Security Communications Advisor, coming out and saying that the UN Security Council resolution was non-binding and that it has no impact at all on Israel and Israel's ability to continue to go after Hamas. And so, in a way, the reaction to the resolution was actually more interesting than the resolution itself.
The U.S. believes, honestly, like that any resolution that passes through the Security Council pertaining to Israel are not legally binding. All other resolutions are legal binding.
Right.
This is the U.S. belief. This
Right.
is how it has always conducted its policies. So to track back a little bit, in 2016, in the final days of the Obama administration in December, and Trump came in January of 2017. So there were only literally just weeks between the day that Resolution 2334 passed and when Trump came into power. So Resolution 2334 called for an end to the settlements expansions, the end to the divisive language that's used by politicians of both Israelis and Palestinians, but it singled out, settler leaders. So in this case would have been Ben-Gvir. So that was one of the last things that the Obama administration actually abstained on. And they said, you know what, we'll let it pass. That resolution continues to it's in effect. And the moment that it passed, the day that it passed, it was in effect. And till now, the U.S. does not, recognize it as legally binding. All other resolutions, surprisingly, are legally binding. And this is the thing about the Security Council, is that all its resolutions, when they're passed, they are legally binding. Under international law, the Security Council is, and again, we can look at the Security Council as an exclusive club. Like, you can't just have all countries of the world to actually come out and vote for things. You need to have a very small council that decides matters of international peace and security. And because of that, the international law dictates that anything that passes through the Security Council is legally binding. The U.S. says, well, hold on a second. Pertaining to Israel, it's not legally binding. Right. We decide when it's legally binding. So it's not necessarily, them debating an issue. It's them evading their responsibility. Right. And the fact that they abstained also shows that, again, in their eyes, pass whatever resolution is going to happen. There is that aspect of international law that allows states such as the United States, Israel, even Russia, for example, to circumvent certain areas of international law, that there is no enforcement mechanism. You don't have, again, people say, send a peacekeeping force of the UN. Well, peacekeeping forces need to be sanctioned by the UN Security Council. And most of the time, they're just there as peacekeepers. It's not armed. It's not them trying to separate two, different sides to a conflict. It's just there to patrol, basically. Okay. So there is no enforcement mechanism. When the U.S. does that, it kind of puts a dent in international relations, and it makes the UN weaker and weaker. Yeah,
I mean, we talked about this when we had Michael Link on. We talked about sort of what happens when nobody follows international law, and it just becomes
because the UN was made. There is a code that says the UN was not made to take humanity to heaven; it's to save her from hell. Because again, people do consider the UN to be, how is the UN allowing this? Well, there are certain things that, for example, if the UN did not exist, UNRWA would not have existed. So things might have been much, much worse. If the UN did not exist, the Palestinians might not have had a chance to go out and document the crimes of the Israeli occupation. So there are certain things. But again, it's empowered by whether countries, especially leaders, such as the US, Russia, and the Permanent Five, whether they abide by it or not and strengthen it or not. And that's what we call the rules-based international order. So there is a lot of bending of those laws and rules that is typically done in certain cases, and these cases are mostly just for Israel.
Right. Okay, and then a few days later, the UN court, the International Court of Justice, issued additional provisional measures. So going back to January 26th, when they issued the provisional measures, when they found that there's a plausible case for genocide that Israel is committing in Gaza, they issued these provisional measures, and they said that Israel, you have a month to come back and submit a report that you are following these additional measures. They submitted the report. South Africa then reviewed the report that was submitted. It was private. It wasn't made public. And requested additional provisional measures, which were granted on March 28th. And they specifically had the right, so the focus was on humanitarian aid. And so, there was 2 additional measures that were provided by the ICJ. And again, the decisions were overwhelming. They were basically unanimous, with the only negative vote coming from the Israeli judge. And so there was, I have some of the wording here. I won't read it all because it is quite lengthy, but take all necessary and effective measures to ensure without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. And so basically this was like capitalized, underlined, like you need to get in aid immediately. And that was that's, it just shows that wasn't happening before, right? And if they wouldn't have needed to issue these additional provisional measures if aid was getting in. These measures came in to say, you absolutely need to figure out a way to get aid in immediately, or not even figure out a way to just stop. You need to stop preventing aid from getting in.
So and you just talked about Michael Link. So Michael Link actually does, I remember I saw one of his conferences, and he did say that, even occupations have laws. There is the law of occupation. And in this case, even wars have, laws. What Israel kind of set out to do from the start is a form of collective punishment. You had Yoav Gallant, who came out and said, cut all water, cut all electricity, do not let anything in. These people are human animals. So that was from the very, very start of this specific situation. And after that, we continued to see how there was no aid coming in. And at that point, the more that it kind of developed, we had the issue of UNRWA, where it was dealing with the fact that countries were pulling out funding like instantly. They stopped its support. And even Israel itself started essentially freezing the bank accounts of UNRWA in Israel, because it does maintain offices in the West Bank and in Israel. So we're dealing with a humanitarian organization that was not able to deliver the aid that it already had or wanted to get. Then you had settler groups and Israeli extremist groups that went to the ports and protested to block the entry of aid that was supposed to go from, it's not from Israel, but it's going through Israel into Kerem Shalom crossing and through into Gaza. And then the other issue too is that Israel actually, there was no infrastructure to deliver the aid. Like especially in the north, the roads were completely dismantled. So even if they were able to come in, it would have been impossible. And then kind of a while later, we saw the what they called the Flower Massacre, in which when the little drops of aid did come in, Israel actually opened fire at civilians who were going for aid. And again, this is a population that has not experienced a normal. Again, Gaza is heavily dependent on aid through normal times. Like I forgot the exact number of trucks that used to come in into 500. Gaza. Exactly. So during normal times, it wouldn't be normal times if you needed 8 trucks to come in. But again, before October, 500 trucks used to come in, and then it cut off completely. And then you are talking about people who are in need of medical aid, who are in need of food. Hospitals are not operating properly. I mean, most of the hospitals have been taken down completely, and they're all located in one specific area of Gaza. That's during the winter. Again, a number of factors, humanitarian factors that you look at. And then after that, that aid was not coming in. Israel was actively blocking it. Some portions of that include the government. Other portions of that include Israelis themselves. So the fact that the ICJ issued that, language is extremely important in the sense that there is, again, it's a form of collective punishment. And cutting basic, needs or basic aid for civilians in armed conflict is a war crime. Like it's not an opinion thing. It's a factual thing. There are certain rules, and if you do not follow these rules as an occupier or a party to a conflict, then you would be considered a war criminal. So these are war crimes. So that language was needed.
Right. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about, what's going on overseas, and we started off talking about Canada. I want to come back to Canada.
Yeah.
And talk about, the conversation that you and I had just had about the detail of all these resolutions and the detail of the motions that are happening.
Yeah.
Average people walking around don't have the time or the necessarily the knowledge to work their way through one of these things on their own.
Yeah.
And so they rely on advocacy groups like Hikma that you're part of, to help decipher the information that's out there.
Yeah.
So you tell us a little bit about Hikma, what you do, and how people can support it.
Yeah, so Hikma was started, I believe, a little bit before or after the Quebec mosque shooting. And its focus was heavily on, combating Islamophobia in London. And previously, it was essentially just volunteer board members who dedicated some time to combat, to work in advocacy. So there is that difference between advocacy at the grassroots level and advocacy through Public Affairs Council or a specific organization such as Hikma. So, we have regular activists, grassroots activists who go out, protest, and just go home, who might not possess the specific skills to understand how to speak to politicians, but also how to listen to politicians. Because, for example, like we looked at the motion, and the average person would look at it and say, you know what, a motion did pass. If it wasn't for advocacy groups, Hikma and others, the average person would say, you know what, I'm going to take it as a win. But then we came out and said, hold on, take it as a loss. Like we had a chance to look at something historical by allowing MPs to go out and vote for or against the recognition of a Palestinian state. They say they support a two-state solution. This is their chance. So the specific language that's used by politicians, I would say it's a different, people speak English, French, Arabic. I would say politics is a different kind of language, and you need to be fluent in it. So this is where organizations like Hikma come in. So we had professionals, we had lawyers, community leaders, and I'm not necessarily just talking about Hikma, but others also included public affairs consultants or professionals in public relations. So you have people who understand the difference in language. So initially, when Hikma started, it was kind of a volunteer board, and they still are a volunteer board. And their focus was heavily on Islamophobia at the domestic level. And then after the June 6, 2021 attack against the Afzal family, kind of the work transformed a little bit, because it does make a big difference in your city when your community is a target of a heinous hate crime, and it required more action. So back in 2021, Hikma actually wanted to recruit someone who's dedicated to advocacy, and not just leave it to the board members, but someone who's out there who is able to meet with the politicians and push for issues of importance for the Muslim community. Like we do have grassroots groups and grassroots individuals that go out and do speak to politicians. But for example, like politicians might come out and say, like, you know what, like we passed a motion. Isn't this great? And right. Some politicians actually did that. Others, for example, will see a tweet by a politician and not read much into it. So this is where they come in and say, like, hold on, like, this happened. This is not a win. This is a loss. A tweet that's by a politician, you can come out and say, you know what, this is fueling hatred. This will target our community. We might be on the receiving end of another attack, for example, in London. So in 2021, Hikma hired an advocacy coordinator, and I happen to be that person. And part of our work before these events actually started to focus on domestic stuff. So things related to the school board and discrimination faced by students in the school boards, discrimination faced by individuals in their workplaces, attacks against community members in London. So there was one case after the June 6th attack. There was another incident at Costco where an elderly Muslim person, who actually happens to be the father of the previous chair of Hikma, so he was attacked or verbally by someone who kind of said very extremist or extremely Islamophobic, racist stuff to him. So we go out and we try to lobby politicians in a way that actually speaks their language. And we have, thankfully, our group has worked immensely worked in a really efficient manner over the past couple of months, and we adjusted. So when this happened, our focus became, again, what can we do domestically to influence the policies at the foreign affairs level? It's very difficult for a small organization like Hikma to influence foreign policy issue. But what we can do is that influence our own local politicians and get them to apply pressure in the respective parties. So we're talking, for example, about the NDP motion. So prior to this, Hikma was meeting, and again, like some of the work that the community does not see directly, we do meet with politicians on regular basis. I text politicians regarding issues of importance. So for example, we talked about the funding of UNRWA. Prior to this, when UNRWA was actually, when the annual contributions to UNRWA were declared in the budget, there was previously, Canada used to fund UNRWA with 30 million every year for 3 years. So we're looking at 90 million in total over 3 years. After it ran out, the government wanted to renew the funding. So they said, you know what, we're going to renew it for 4 years, and we're going to give you 100 million, right? In the service level, you look at it, that's great. They renewed it, they increased it, that's 100 million, it's amazing. I took a step back and I texted the politicians that I know. I set up calls. I said, hey, hold on a second. You actually brought it down. It's not, it didn't increase. You brought it down.
We can do math, yeah.
Exactly. So there is that, that kind of work that we do on a daily basis, that we go behind the scenes and we try to lobby, use our own connections. We try to lobby using issues of importance for the community. After October, that transformed massively. So just for context, I am Hikma's only paid employee. Everyone else is a board member. And the amount of work that it's myself and the board, have put in since October is I'm not trying to brag, but Hikma, over the past couple of months, we have done, I believe, like work way above we're punching above our weight limit. We went all the way to Ottawa to meet with leaders of the parties. We were part of the delegation that canceled the meeting with the Prime Minister. We met with the Deputy Prime Minister to push for example, like issues of importance to London. So the evacuation of Londoners stuck in Gaza. We pushed for resumed funding of UNRWA. We presented fact sheets and backgrounders to politicians. And we kept lobbying politicians like every single day. And we understand that the community also wants to be involved. So we do stuff also in front of the community. So we have a portion behind the scenes, but we also do it for the community. So we have the action alerts that do go out. It's simply just, send a letter to your MP. That's the simplest way that you can be involved politically. Just put your name, send it. It takes 30 seconds. That forms the basis of how an MP decides how to vote on certain things. So and I'll try to wrap up this question quickly. And prior to the motion, I called one of the MPs and I said, hey, like, what can we do as a community? She said, you know what, like, your community is pushing massively, and I've never experienced this in, you know, at any point in my life as a politician. I've never seen that level of engagement. Keep it up. This is what you need right now. And she said, however, the other group is pushing, but, you know, it's silent. But it's matching the number of emails that your community is sending. So you need to ramp it up. You need to push more and more emails, because this forms exactly like, if you're a politician, you need to represent your community. And if you only hear from one side, you don't hear from the other, or one side is more vocal than the other, then it's very easy for you to make a position or to take a position. So for example, we sent an action alert for 2 weeks in a row. We said, like, hey, send a letter to your MP. We sent it to at least a grassroots level. We said, send a letter to your MP. Do this. We drafted new things. So, for example, on Palestine, Sudan, the attack against Yemen, we actually have something coming out regarding the recent escalation in the region. That people are making calls, and again, that's the reason why you need advocacy groups like Hikma, because we understand that the other side came out and said, you know what, Israel is a big victim, and continue to fund or continue to support it in a military way, provide it with the weapons that it needs, even though that resolution or that motion specifically said, you know what, we're going to cut the future transfers of weapons.
Right.
So we were able to go in and we understand exactly who's saying what and to who, and we started drafting things for instantly, even before that statement that came out yesterday from the Prime Minister. And we said, hold on a second. What happened? You can discuss it, you can talk about it, but essentially, there was a state that attacked a consulate of another state in a third country. This is essentially like, you can't justify expanding the sales of weapons or resuming them because one state instigated another, and now there was a response, which, again, like, I'm not taking a position on this, but I'm just saying that the way that international relations work is that you instigate something, there is a response.
Right.
So we as Hikma, we were able to go in and understand exactly what is being said behind closed doors. We're able to contribute to those discussions, and that actually allowed us to, I think, in London and the NDP Motion, through the lobbying efforts, we've seen the 3 MPs, the 2 Liberal and the 1 NDP, vote in favor, and the only MP from the Conservative Party that actually abstained and did not vote for or against the motion was the one from London. And we can contribute that to the advocacy efforts that we do. Again, an abstention is nothing, but at least we can take that as a win for the community and say, you know what, like, a party that is known for its anti-Palestinian sentiment, we are able to influence an MP because we're able to work with them and we're able to show them the other side in a way that's professional, in a way that is, again, it speaks the same language as they do. We do have the advocates who go out and say, like, Israel needs to respect international law. Yeah, Israel needs to respect international law, but it does not. Try to push for example, what are the implications of Canada or on Canada if Israel does not respect international law? What are the implications on Canada if UNRWA ceases to exist? Forget international law for a second. You need to speak the same language as politicians, which is the self-interest of Canada. This is the discussion of realism versus idealism, and politicians in Canada are interested in the idealist nature or the realist nature of politics, which is, how can Canada maintain its influence? How can Canada maintain its power? So we are able to go in and dissect all of that.
And that's where you make our lives easy.
I really hope so. I really hope so.
I don't want to speak the language of politicians. I want to speak my language and keep things simple. And that's why I myself, I'm
but you need both, right?
I get both. That. But I'm saying I am as a concerned citizen who does not want to, or does not have the time to, or does not have the knowledge to sit through these resolutions, and I can send emails to my MPs and I can call my MP, but with some guidance from a local group like Hikma, what I do to achieve those things is I just support Hikma on a monthly basis.
Yeah,
That's what I do. So I have an automatic setup. If you go to like Hikma.ca, HIKMA.ca, you set up a monthly donation, and then instead of you having to sit through and think about all these great resolutions, and then the way they're written, you can get somebody like Muhammad to do that for you and explain it in a much easier way, and advocate on your behalf. So if you are listening to this and you want to support the work that Hikma does, then again, I'll put the link in the description, but it's HIKMA.ca, and you can support their work financially, but you can also jump onto their section about petitions and action alerts, join their mailing list, and then every time Hamad writes a great email that goes to an MP or sets something up, then you can participate in that.
Yeah, and inshallah, like we do have certain plans for the future. Like we do want to get the community involved. We will be holding sessions to help individuals in London and hopefully online to advocate better and advocate effectively. We will try to hold sessions for students in order to make them ambassadors of the community on campus, to know what to say and what not to say, and to know what to do and what not to do. So we are trying to push for that. But the focus right now, the community is hurting, and we know the focus has been on Palestine. But again, like we try to focus also on Sudan. We try to focus also a little bit on Yemen. So we are trying to make do with whatever resources that we have. But as you said, like the support is extremely important for Hikma to continue its work. Essentially, other than myself, it is a team of volunteers, and I try to balance my official government work with advocating for the community. And again, like in a manner that respects the government's positions, but also respects the community's priorities and wishes. So I think. Again, like I think over the past couple of months, Hikma did take a big step, and hopefully we will try to continue the momentum as much as possible.
Thank you for getting us all caught up here on what's going on in the last month. I feel like we're going to need monthly sessions of everything that's going on, because there's just so much going on to wrap up. But thanks again.
No problem. Thank you for having me. I loved it.